Dan Hurley and UConn beat Baylor by implementing some brilliant offensive tactics to attack what Baylor did on defense. We're going to break down what two of those were and why they were so effective. Let's go. First thing to establish is what type of defense Baylor was playing. The type of defense Baylor is playing is essentially switching everywhere across the board. We can see as anything interchanges here, one defender simply stays here, the other stays here. I actually am a huge fan of this style of defense. However, there are obviously ways to exploit it, as there are with every defense. We saw every little ball screen there, every handoff. The defenders simply switch. Not only on ball, but also off ball. Those two switched right there as he came up off that screen. The first couple of possessions, I think this gave UConn quite a bit of trouble. However, obviously Dan Hurley being a good coach, they were able to address this in timeouts, address this in stuff they had talked about before the game, and were able to use it to create a lot of good offensive looks, as opposed to this first one they got, which was probably not a good offensive look. There are two really efficient ways, I think, to take advantage of screens, and Dan Hurley did both of them. The first one, I think, is a much simpler concept, and that is simply when you switch, that means you put somebody that was big on now somebody who was small. Okay, so you are simply switching between guard and post player. That is what we can see with Sampson down here. As this ball gets to the middle, you're going to have an opportunity where you have a huge size advantage, and that creates a good look for UConn. UConn didn't intentionally go to this very often. However, they kind of went to it like in the flow of their offense. So as this ball screen happens, Johnson is now rolling to the rim, and his player, who was a big, is no longer on him. That means you have a size advantage where Sampson's in here on one of these two guards. Frankly, it doesn't matter which one. UConn gets the ball to the inside, simply drops it off, and you have a massive size advantage. You have no one who's going to be able to block Sampson's shot, and he shoots it essentially right over the top of them. Those first two examples, I think, were largely situational based. They weren't intentionally going to. I think this last one is a much clearer example of something that UConn intentionally tried to get the ball into Sampson. Okay, we see screens being set. All right, so now we have it established. We have Sampson with a guard. Okay, what is UConn going to do? They're going to space the floor. Okay, you're going to put shooters on the outside. You're going to make it so no one else can rotate to help Sampson. 3 brings his defender up, and 30, obviously a good shooter, McNeely, means this big cannot help over. Okay, Baylor is already aware of this. They're fronting. You can see these players were trying to cheat down, but because UConn space the floor so well, they have nowhere to go. They can't leave their shooter because they have good shooters. Okay, UConn simply acknowledges this, and DR makes not the cleanest looking pass, but a pass over the top, where Sampson is the only one that can get it, and the rest of the defense is too late to cause any meaningful change. The second way to counter switching defenses is far and away, I think, more complex. The reason it's more complex is it involves a much more nuanced understanding of the game, and it involves understanding from 5 players. And that is essentially trying to confuse the defense on when switches are occurring versus not. We can see in this first example, 5 is going to come down and set this ball screen right here. The reason why this is confusing is because UConn's running in circles. I've documented this in the past where UConn just runs in circles, but the reason it confuses the defense is because there's so many moving parts. And when you have a defense that switches or not, it puts a lot of strain on the defense. And so the reason he's running off this screen in particular is because the big is not in a place where he's going to be able to come out here and switch. And so because he's not going to be able to switch, you know you're going to have more of an advantage, and you're going to have this gap if 5 can catch him at all on that screen, which he does. And so that was a good look from UConn. We can see a very similar concept here. We're going to see one in particular. Again, these two players are running in circles. It looks silly, but the reason is because it confuses a switching defense. They don't know who's switching to who. And as players come back out here, you get caught. And it's important to note he gets caught on the screen. But the reason he gets caught on the screen is because Sampson isn't screening the player that was guarding one. Instead, he's screening his own player. Why is he screening his own player? Because his player was the one that was going to switch out onto one, and so because he screened him, he was unable to complete that switch, and you had another open shot. Different wrinkle, but the exact same concept. Okay, we have lots of motion going on from UConn. We're watching McNeely in particular, and we're going to have both screens coming here and screens coming here. As McNeely comes across, there's a switch right there, and what happens? He's going to come across. This other player is now become the switch. There's miscommunication because Sampson is kind of setting the screen, kind of not. Either way, it causes confusion for Baylor, and Baylor has a long closeout because the switch would have happened here, but he's all the way out here, so if McNeely drifts back, which is what he does, it creates a lot of space that he has to cover, and again, UConn puts switching in a difficult position. And so then there was a period of time where Baylor switched defenses. They went to a little bit of zone. They went to a little bit of non-switching, especially when the post player 5 was in the game. However, the issue is UConn, in their offense, it still works just fine despite Dan Hurley being stressed up here. If you don't switch, the exact same concept applies. So again, we see this is almost the exact same set. Frankly, I think it is the exact same set. I think just 5 and Samson were in different spots. And so again, we see confusion on this switch right here. That is the desired goal. And so that's the issue. If you're not going to switch the big, this player gets confused a little bit, whether he's switching or not, and forcing them to change defenses causes a lot of issues. And so 5 right here, we talked earlier about how Samson screamed his own player, but instead of 5, he's getting ready to screen his own player. He's like, oh wait, my player's not going out there. It's this dude that's trying to close out late, so he simply adjusts over, catch the piece of him, and again, you have another wide open look from UConn based on their style of offense. Switch or no switch, it causes a lot of issues because of the motion and chaos. And then finally, we have a nice icing on the cake. This is after a timeout. This is a crucial set from UConn. I mean, you're up 2, you want to extend that lead. We're watching Samson in particular. This is pinnacle Dan Hurley. I absolutely love it. Ball movement to get it started just to confuse the defense a little bit. And just to make sure they're moving, make sure they're not thinking intentionally. Hey, we see they're switching. This is the intended setup right here. Hey, as Samson goes to set the screen, he's going to slip the screen. This puts this is what would qualify as a difficult switch because they're not sure whether the screen is actually being set, whether they're switching or not because he leaves the switch just a little bit early. And so that makes it so both players are out of position. 13's coming up. This player was coming up and now has to fully change trajectory. And Samson simply releases, and it's an easy dunk for UConn. Dan Hurley coached a beautiful game attacking Baylor's switching defense.